Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many bright faces here. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and learn more about tiny home village efforts in Eugene, Oregon. My name is Bernadette Mieta. I'm the project manager for the county's Tiny Home Village project. And it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening. I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping things. Please turn off your cell phones, silence them. Secondly, restrooms are out the doors to your right and then on the left. So if you need to leave, feel free to do so. This is the third in a series of 4 educational forums that the Bernalillo County Tiny Home Village Advisory Committee is sponsoring, along with community members. And tonight we're very fortunate to have Andrew Heben here from Eugene, Oregon, to talk about their project. One of the things that we have done in this advisory committee is a ton of research about tiny homes throughout the country, looking at best practices, what works, what doesn't. We're trying to do our homework so we can really bring the best possible project here to Albuquerque. With that, I would like to introduce Marge Pettit. She is coming to tell her personal story, and then we will follow up with the Heben presentation. We will then have Commissioner Debbie O'Malley and Councilor Diane Gibson up, and then we will open up for Q&A. So please, if you could hold on to your questions and comments till after the presentation and after both Commissioner and Councilor have presented to you. So with that, Marge, if you could go ahead and come on up. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Does this come off, or do I have to stay?
No, you can take it off. Just there you go, and you can roam.
Thank you. I'm a roamer. I wanted to share my story tonight because I was born and raised in Albuquerque, South Valley. I'll put this down. I was raised in a typical New Mexican family. And when I say I was the oldest daughter, that might mean something to people in this room. Because in the 60s and 70s, we were given minimal options. So I wrote a book about my life called I Don't Make Round Tortillas. And after being married for 25 years and climbing the corporate ladder, I was an employee of the city of Albuquerque, contract work with Sandia National Laboratories. I was married to an Intel executive, worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, and then I had a physical accident that left me paralyzed. And after a year and a half of not being able to move, I realized that my life was a failure. And I grabbed a cane and a backpack, and the keys, I dropped them to my Intel Life and my Jaguar, because my mobility was more important to me than anything else. As a result, I was traveling. I still have money in the bank. I just didn't want to be in that scenario anymore. So I went to Venice Beach. This was 2001. And I went to Romania. And I went to Amsterdam. I did all the things I wanted to do. And then the inevitable happened, and I got divorced. And my insurance was gone. And I had another accident that required another surgery. And it took me months this time, starting at UNM Hospital, going to Colorado. And I went back to the surgeon. At that point, I had my final settlement. And I decided that I was going to invest in me. I sold my first painting at 50 years old. When you're raised in an abusive New Mexican family, there are no paints. You didn't go to West Mesa and say, I'm abused to your favorite art teacher. I lost that whole part of my life. And I came back to Albuquerque as a result of needing to be around my family again. I'm 60 years old now. My father passed away recently. He was the retired chief of Kirtland Air Force Base Fire Department. My cousin is Senator James G. Taylor. My other cousin is a retired chief of police for 25 years, Frank Taylor. I'm Annabelle Taylor. And then I married Mr. Pettit, and I go by Marge Pettit. But I signed my painting Z, the letter Z, the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. I realized at the end of my story comes when I was looking for a community that would rescue me the way I wanted to. I spent 2 years ago in Eugene, and I spent the summer living at Alton Baker Park in a tent. I call us gypsies. From there I went and I applied at Opportunity Village. There were certain concessions I had to follow and I didn't qualify. One of them is I needed my medical marijuana. So I ended up at Whoville. Whoville was the longest standing Occupy movement left over from the Occupy movement. And I knew if I left my stuff there, I'd be safe. I was able to pitch a tent with 30 other people next to a federal building. I came in and out of my bicycle and I sold a lot of artwork in Eugene. I made more money there in a week than I had made all year around the country. I lived in Venice Beach, San Francisco, Seattle, San Diego, and Slab City. I lived by my own artwork. I didn't get any government programs. I didn't get anything left over from my pension. When I turned 62, Sandia Labs and Intel will take care of me. Until then, I wanted to be an artist. All my craft was learned on the streets, wire wrapping in Eugene, painting. And now I came back here and I'm famous for doing chalk murals all over Central. I represent Two-Way Street, the new newspaper, because I believe in it. I have in my possession sketches that I've been doing as a trained draftsman at TVI, now CNM, for what I believe is a community. I was in Portland, and I asked one of the state workers, "What housing do you have for me?" And she said, "Here's one for people in recovery." And I said, I'm not in recovery. She said, "Here's one for domestic violence survivors." And I said, "I don't want to be around women that are complaining about their lives. I've already fixed mine." And I said, "Where in your book are the homes for creative geniuses that want to flourish and build music and art and poetry as a means of life?" And she closed her government book and said, "Good luck with that." I'm here to help. Thank you.
So thank you, Marge, for your powerful story. Sure.
I'm sorry. This is important. I've been living on the streets of Albuquerque downtown, and I love it. Don't feel sorry for me. I've learned to live with everybody because I was born in Budga. I'm almost going to cry. I got housed last night.
Thank you for your powerful story and sharing that, Marge. Okay, now for our main event, Andrew Heben. He is the author of Tent City Urbanism. He is a planner and a tiny home builder. So he really walks the talk. So we're very happy to have him. I'll let him explain more about his background. So we're very happy to have Andrew Heben to come and talk about his tiny home village, Opportunity Village, in Eugene, Oregon, and then their permanent housing model called Emerald Village. So with that, Andrew?
All right. Thank you, Bernadette, and thank you, Marge, for that story. And thank all of you for coming out to learn more about tiny house villages. It's very exciting to be here. I was supposed to be here a little over a month ago, and I actually injured my hand building one of the houses. I had to have surgery to get a piece of wood out of there, but I'm back to normal now. I can move my hand and ready to give the presentation. It was also very exciting to learn that last year voters approved by an overwhelming majority a bond measure to fund a tiny house village project here. Yes, that's very cool. I've done a lot of these presentations in different cities, and it's usually just a concept at that stage, and thinking about how to raise the money is way down the line, but having that lined up front shows that people here already understand that this is something that should and can be done. I can't speak to the details of the local project here, but what I hope to do is provide some inspiration on how to get there and how to create a successful village. A little bit of my background: I'm a project director at Square One Villages, which is a nonprofit in Eugene, Oregon. We have a mission of creating self-managed communities of cost-effective tiny homes for people in need of housing. We have 2 models for doing that: Opportunity Village, which provides temporary transitional tiny homes, and Emerald Village, which is currently under development, which will provide permanent affordable tiny homes. And I'll get into some details about those projects later on. And then I also wrote a book called Tent City Urbanism, which started as a thesis project. So that's kind of how I got interested in this whole topic. Back in 2009, I began reading about the rise of tent cities in the United States. The story was covered in just about every major media outlet at the time. It started with the Oprah Winfrey Show, and then I think The Guardian, and from there it got covered pretty widespread. And you saw a lot of these pictures where they were basically depicting the tent cities as visual symbols of the economic recession of the time. But there wasn't a lot of substance to the articles in terms of how these camps were organized or what was going on at the time. And so as an urban planning student at the time, you're taught to include the people that you're planning for in the process. But with the issue of homelessness, this oftentimes gets forgotten. Social services tend to be vertically organized where help is handed down. And we often forget to involve the people in the process. So these tent cities seem to be places where people who were falling through the cracks of traditional responses to homelessness and poverty were creating their own solutions for developing a shelter model. And so I found that to be an optimal grounds to develop an alternative shelter model that might be more accommodating to meeting these people's needs. So this is a picture of Camp Take Notice. Part of that thesis project was traveling around the country and visiting some of these camps that I had read about, and I lived in this camp here in Ann Arbor for a month to observe, and understand what these camps were actually like. And while obviously living in a tent is not ideal, the physical conditions were far from ideal, I found that there's actually a lot of positive social dynamics in the place that I was staying. Some of those dynamics that I observed: peer support, so people in a similar situation were working together to improve their collective situation. So rather than help only being handed down, the organizational structure was more horizontal, where people were working together. They were making decisions democratically. They had weekly camp meetings where basically they voted on issues on how to provide a safe and sanitary camp and how to operate on the day-to-day level. And it actually allowed people that are accustomed to not being asked what they think to be active participants in their living situations. And that was something, when I talked to people, they found very empowering. Self-management, so they formed committees to actually put those decisions into action. And then just a general sense of ingenuity, where people were coming up with creative solutions to make do with very little resources and come up with creative solutions for drastic improvements in quality of life compared to sleeping on the street or camping alone. So the focus of my thesis project then became, how can we improve the physical components of the tent city while still maintaining the social dynamics that I talk about here. And so in my book, I outline 3 different models for bridging the gap between the street and conventional low-income housing. Conventional low-income housing can often cost new construction upwards of $200,000 per unit. And leaving people on the street, there's various studies showing that that can cost $20,000 to $40,000 per person per year. So as a taxpayer, you're going to be paying for this in one way or another. So I looked at 3 models for how we can provide some alternative solutions for bridging that large gap between the street and a conventional apartment. The first model was a sanctuary camp. So keeping the very basic infrastructure of a tent city, but providing a safe and legal place to be with nonprofit oversight. Provides drastic improvements compared to being moved around and evicted from site to site. And I should preface all this by saying we've now in Eugene, Oregon, implemented all three of these models. So in Eugene, we implemented a rest stop ordinance, which allows up to 20 tents or Conestoga huts to exist on city-approved sites with nonprofit oversight. So the nonprofit I work with isn't involved directly with these programs, but there have been other community organizations that have developed to operate these rest stops. I believe there's 6 of them throughout the city currently, and it's designed to provide the most basic emergency shelter. People aren't allowed to stay there during the day, but it's basically providing a safe, legal place to camp rather than having it take place illegally. The second model was a transitional village. So taking those concepts of the tent city and improving the physical infrastructure where you transcend from tents to simple tiny houses that are able to be movable either on wheels or on pier blocks that can be lifted up and transported on a flatbed truck. So still very ephemeral infrastructure, but you're off the ground, you have some degree of insulation, a place to lock up your stuff, and then supported by common facilities that provide restrooms, kitchens, and gathering spaces. So in Eugene, we implemented this model called Opportunity Village. It opened in August of 2013, so it actually predated the rest stops. It was started as a 1-year pilot project, sort of as a trial in our city to see if this concept has worked. And I'll get much more into this project later on. The third model that I have is the affordable village. So creating accessible and sustainable places to transition to. So moving on up to permanent houses that have a small bathroom and kitchenette in the unit, qualifies as permanent housing, but more affordable and cost-effective than traditional apartment structures. So this is pretty exciting. It's the first presentation I've done where this isn't a rendering. So this is actually currently under development. It's Emerald Village in Eugene, and we are scheduled to have our first residents move in December. So we'll be looking at some pictures of that development later on. And I briefly just wanted to touch on some of the other projects that follow similar components to the projects I just went over, to emphasize that this is not exclusively a Eugene, Oregon thing, but I wanted to look at some of the other examples. This is Dignity Village in Portland, Oregon. And while it may have its issues, it's sort of the pioneer of this whole concept. It opened back in 2001. So this is a picture back when it was just a camp that was being evicted from by the city from site to site to site. I believe they moved around a dozen times. Before 2001, they were given a piece of city-owned sanctioned land where they now have 45 self-constructed tiny houses built on really a shoestring budget where largely used recycled materials to create these little houses, and really a pioneer of the whole village model that I'm talking about back in 2001. So that's been around for 17 years without any major issues. Next, Seattle, Washington. This is a camp called Nicholsville that was also moved around the city dozens of times. They actually started having sanctioned tent cities at the same time as Dignity Village back in 2001, but they were still living in tents, and they had to move from site to site every 3 months. So there's a network of churches that hosted these 100-person tent cities that would move around the city. But just a couple years ago, they built their first tiny house village. And I think this is a really interesting case study. It's 13 or 14 of these little houses, and it's built on a single family lot. And it's surrounded on all 4 sides by other single family houses. So it really shows how this use can actually coexist in the middle of a neighborhood. And when I visited, I talked to the neighbors of these different houses, and they all had nothing but good things to say about their neighbors. So I think, that Dignity Village example, it's way out by the airport. It's really far out there, but I think this idea of moving, showing that this can be something that can be successful in a neighborhood is a sort of a groundbreaking thing that this project did. And I believe they now have 6 or 7 of these within the past 2 years. It's a partnership between the Low Income Housing Institute and SHARE. Quixote Village started out as Camp Quixote, so you'll notice all these started out as itinerant camps that were evicted throughout the city, but after enough struggle, these cities finally realized that something better could be done. And this is probably actually the nicest example. It's a 30-unit, permanent, supportive housing model. They have half baths in the tiny houses, and then it's supported by a community building that has showers, bathtubs, and a larger community kitchen. This is also an example, the only example of the ones I'll show that was funded by public funding with CDBG and HUD funding. So it's kind of an example of how this model can actually fit into traditional funding sources, although a few concessions had to be made. Madison, Wisconsin, the first easternmost example, started with the Occupy camp back in 2011. But after that camp was evicted, people got together to plan a new project. They fundraised to purchase an automotive shop. And I think it's a really creative adaptive reuse example where they basically renovated the shop building to be where they build the tiny houses, and then they also have the bathrooms and the kitchen and a meeting space in there. And then in the area around the shop and the yard where they used to keep the cars, they have 9 different tiny houses that are clustered around that common space. There's a picture from the open house. And then a few more that have just opened. Denver, Colorado, beloved community village. Portland, Oregon, just opened Kenton Women's Village. They had a bunch of local architects and builders that each designed one of these 14 houses, so they all look very different and eclectic. And then Medford, Oregon, Hope Village under construction. And I just attended their open house last weekend. They just broke ground and had their residents move in. So it was the first example in Southern Oregon. So what are the components that kind of tie all of these projects together? First, obviously, they all have tiny houses, so they make use of compact structures of 400 square feet or less. They all then support those simple structures with common buildings that create more amenities for the residents in terms of bathrooms and kitchens and gathering spaces. Third is resident management. To various degrees, the projects all involve the residents in decision making, and that creates a sense of ownership that's really a foundational piece to creating this village model, and I think why it has broken down so many stereotypes. 4 is community agreement. So everybody that lives there, this isn't an unconditional, anyone can come, show up, and live here, but there's a basic set of community agreements that people have to agree to in order to live there. 5, there's a village meeting at least once a month in all these projects, where part of living there means you come to a meeting and discuss issues of common interest and make decisions about how the village is operated and managed. And then 6, there's a nonprofit sponsor that provides oversight and support and administration. So it's not just like you give people a key to the house and say, here you go, but there's some structure and organizational oversight to the whole thing. So what are the key benefits of this model? I could make a much longer list, but these are sort of the primary ones that I see. 1, it's a cost-effective way to meet people's basic needs. 2, it preserves resident privacy and autonomy rather than the traditional shelter model, which often strips those rights. 3, it creates a supportive community setting. And 4, despite all the concerns and fears you hear every time one of these projects is proposed, each of these examples can be shown to have a positive impact on the surrounding community rather than a negative. So with that sort of overview to the whole concept, I was going to dive a little more into two of the projects that we've developed with our nonprofit called Square One Villages. The first is Opportunity Village, and it serves as that temporary transitional model, that first step off the street. And I thought I would start with a short video segment that was done by PBS a couple years ago to give you guys an on-the-ground view of what it's like there before diving more into it myself. We'll see if this works. Yes.
It's a gated community. It's a gated community for the homeless.
It's called Opportunity Village. It's transitional housing for the homeless, and it's unlike almost any other in the country.
They're like cute little miniature houses, and I think it's something that the average person can relate to.
Andrew Heben is an urban planner recently out of college and author of a book about tent cities. He spearheaded the design of Opportunity Village and calls the miniature houses bungalows.
While it may not be much, just having a small place to call your own is a pretty important thing, no matter how small it is.
It's a heck of a lot better than sleeping under a bridge.
This is Pastor Dan Bryant, senior minister of the First Christian Church in Eugene, Oregon. He's the president of the board at Opportunity Village. He also has individual shelters for the homeless on church property. Conventional development of low-income housing costs on average about $200,000 per unit. They're a little larger, of course, and they have indoor plumbing and electricity. But all the little houses here, all 30 of them, added together cost less than half of one federally funded unit. And they didn't cost taxpayers a single dime.
Got to learn how to share food here, so we got 2 fridges here, 30 people.
The village has a community kitchen where residents can cook their own meals. It may be outdoors, but it's spotless. Individual units don't have electricity, but that's a small problem for people who have been sleeping in dark, shadowy places. People like Robin.
Because what I got now is I got it hooked up, my lights hooked up. So I have lights running off of 18-volt batteries.
Those people that think that this would be a good idea, can we get a show of hands?
This is another unique aspect to Opportunity Village that organizers say was influenced by the Occupy movement.
And everyone's required to attend a village meeting, and all decisions are made in that village meeting. And so that's where everything's dealt with, and so the whole village, I mean, it's, you know, democracy at its most basic level.
This is Catherine. She likes that residents have a say.
It gives you a chance to have a voice, you know. You don't feel like nobody's listening to you. You feel like you have some control over your life.
There's some well-worn faces here, but there are plenty that look like your neighbors. Tony, for instance, lost her job and then everything else. Now she's employed as a caregiver.
It's my own little place where I can regroup and get my paperwork ready and get ready for work. And we have showers here that we share and wash our clothes here, and I'm able to get to work and look clean and presentable.
Catherine and Ron Griffith moved in here after she lost her job and the roof fell in.
I kept saying it couldn't get any worse, but then it kept getting worse. I tell people at the beginning of April of last year, I had a 3-bedroom home, everything that goes with that. My 2 adult children were living with me, and I had a mother, and we thought everything was good. By the end of May, I had none of that. It was all gone by the end of May.
Now Catherine has a job, and she and Ron live in an apartment downtown.
Coming here and things just start falling into place, and, you know, and now we're successful members of the community. And
the village has been such a success, the city extended its lease. The next project will be called Emerald Village. There, the bungalows will be twice as big. These will be for the homeless who have a job but don't make enough to rent or own a place of their own. For Religion and Ethics News Weekly, I'm Lucky Severson in Eugene, Oregon.
All right, so I thought that segment just kind of provides a good context to the project. But how did we get there? So I was going to go through the process of the planning and approvals for opening Opportunity Village. Similar to the Madison project, the roots for our movement started back in the fall of 2011 with the Occupy camp. This happened, I think, in lots of cities where you had these camps that opened up, and what started out as a place of protest soon became a place of refuge for those in the city without any other place to go. and soon you had otherwise housed folks living side by side with otherwise unhoused folks. And when that camp was finally evicted just a couple days before Christmas in 2011, we had some political leadership that recognized there was an issue, and so they created the Opportunity Eugene Task Force to identify new and innovative ways for dealing with this issue. And it involved different stakeholders from throughout the city, but I think it was really influenced by a lot of the lessons that were learned at the Occupy camp. And the number one recommendation was to direct city staff to work with community members to identify potential sites in order to establish a safe and secure place to be 24/7 with independent oversight and financials provided by a nonprofit. So we wanted to hold our city to that recommendation, and so a group of advocates began meeting once a week to talk about what this place to be should look like and how it should be managed. Those examples I gave in Portland and Seattle predated us, so we visited those to see what worked well there and what didn't work so well and what they would change. We came up with this conceptual drawing. It's organized similar to a lot of the tent camps that I visited, where you have clusters of dwellings clustered around common open spaces where you have multiple front doors facing each other to put more eyes on the street and creates safer environments where people feel safe leaving their belongings when they go out during the day, and then common buildings to support those tiny houses. But it wasn't a quick or easy process, even though we had that recommendation by that task force. It took a lot of struggle to get there. So here, this was outside of a city council meeting where they're about to talk about the homelessness issue for the 100th time. And we decided to set up a couple displays. These are actually across the street from each other. One being a Sleeps protest camp, similar to what Marge was talking about with the Whoville camp. This was a movement called Sleeps, where basically they were setting up tent cities throughout the city in very visible locations to draw attention to the fact that it's illegal to sleep if you're homeless. And then across the street, we provided an example of this very first prototype shelter that we built called the Conestoga Hut. So it's sort of a strong visual juxtaposition where you have a very obvious problem next to a potential solution that was not able to be used due to current legality of the situation. But at that meeting, there was two sort of groundbreaking events that happened. The first was that they approved the Conestoga Hut in the overnight sleeping program in the city of Eugene, which allows up to 3 and now 6 vehicles. So it's designed for vehicles, people with cars or campers to park in city-approved sites. They're often in church parking lots. And they extended that to also include Conestoga huts, which are more accessible to folks than a car or vehicle or a camper if they don't already have one. The other thing that happened was that they made a motion to locate a pilot project for a low-cost micro-housing project for homeless individuals at the city-owned North Garfield site. They identified 3 steps to be taken. So selection of a nonprofit to develop and operate the pilot project, enter into a lease agreement with that organization, and to consult with that organization as it prepares an application for a conditional use permit. So it started by the city have basically identified 6 sites that met some basic criteria in terms of proximity to transportation and bus stops, access to utilities like water and electricity, and the size that we were looking for, which was about 1 acre to accommodate 30 units. They narrowed that down to the North Garfield site here. It's not an ideal location. It's in a sort of a light industrial zone, but definitely more central than the Dignity Village example I talked about, within walking distance to the Whitaker neighborhood, which has a business district where people can shop and do things like that. This is the 1 acre site. It's basically a 2 acre site. It's city-owned land, public works. It's where they used to store their vehicles, but as you can see, it was pretty underutilized. So they basically consolidated all their vehicles to the back acre and then put a fence on the back there. So we have the front acre of the site here. Adapted that concept plan I showed you earlier to the site, applied some of the same principles. And then, everything was permitted by the city, so it went through the zoning and land use process. We had to get a conditional use permit. It was basically permitted as a homeless shelter, which ironically is only permitted in the city of Eugene in an industrial area or a heavy office area. And then it was viewed by the building department as an organizational campground, so we followed similar regulations to that. That whole process took about 3 months to get through, your land use approvals, but we decided to pre-select our residents and come up with an application and intake process in the beginning of that, so that we had those. We selected the first dozen residents. They were meeting bi-weekly during those 3 months before we opened, and we developed a village manual, which basically outlines the policies and procedures of how the village is operated and managed. And that's up on our website if you care to look at those details a little closer. And also the community agreement, which I mentioned earlier, is sort of like the lease, the basic agreement that everybody signs. And the overarching 5 principles we borrowed from Dignity Village because, if they already worked there for a decade, why reinvent the wheel? So no violence to yourself or others, no theft. We don't require people to be clean and sober, but we don't allow alcohol, illegal drugs, or drug paraphernalia on site. No persistent disruptive behavior, and everyone must contribute to the operation and maintenance of the village. So each person puts in 10 hours a week towards that to keep the village running. Who gets to live there? This is in our city contract, basically. Somebody that's currently unhoused, somebody that's willing to agree to those basic agreements I just mentioned, being willing to participate in the governance of the village, come to meetings, be willing to undergo a criminal background check and interview process through the neighborhood association and city process. We aren't allowed to accept sex offenders, but we do accept people with criminal backgrounds. We just ask people be honest, and we review those a little closer. And then, because it's a homeless shelter, the city required us to have, people have to be 18 or older, so no kids there. So, by August 2013, we had permits in hand, and this is a copy of the city contract, which I think is a really good resource for any city looking to start a similar project. It's basically the agreement between our nonprofit and the city of Eugene. The city of Medford that I just mentioned that just opened a similar project basically used the exact same agreement, just changing a few words here and there. But it basically serves as a template for answering questions like how do you handle liability insurance and things like that. So this is a before picture, August 2013. This is a picture the first day after we got on the site. So we asked residents, do you want to wait until we finish everything and then move in then, or do you want to move in now and help build it? And so people were able to move in tents and actually help build it. This first day we had over 100 people out on the site to help build the homes. I think we built 5 or 6 houses in that first day. We also dug our own utilities. I always like to include this photo just because it reminds me. I think that's just cool that people dug their own water line. This picture kind of shows the building process. So these are super basic structures, that we built for around $2,000 a piece. But we used a modular panelization technique. So we took care of a lot of the technical building pieces in our shop off-site where we built these panels, floor panels, wall panels, and roof panels. They all utilize the standard dimensions of lumber. So we took a 4x8 sheet of plywood, then framed out that with 2x4s, and then insulated them, and then put an interior panel on there. And you have a panel, you put that on a trailer, and then so we basically build as many panels as we could in a month. And then on the last Saturday of the month, we'd bring the panels over to the site and have volunteer work parties where people put them together, and we'd label all the panels so it's very easy to put them together, and they basically go together like a puzzle. So I just got a few pictures of roofs going on because it looks pretty awesome. There's a cluster of the houses coming together, and then a finished product there. So this is sort of a temporary It was basically approved as a year-long pilot project, so a design constraint was that everything that we built here had to be designed to be picked up and moved if it wasn't successful. But we wanted to design something that was attractive enough and that would last long enough that people wouldn't want to move it if it was successful. So the individual houses themselves aren't hooked up to utilities. We have solar kits that provide lighting and charging of small devices in the units, but then the actual physical infrastructure is consolidated to common buildings. So we have a common kitchen and pantry that's stocked once a week. We have residents that can go and shop for the entire village at Food for Lane County, and they get like 200 or 300 pounds of food a week, so nobody goes hungry. We have a bathhouse with 2 bathrooms, a shower, and a laundry room, and then a 30-foot yurt there, over there on the left. I have a pointer. And that basically serves as the central living room of the village. I've got a few more pictures of that later on, but this is an example of some gardens going on at the village so that folks can grow some of their own food. And then this is May 2014, so 9 months after that before picture, we have a completed product where you have 30 tiny homes, around 35 people living there at a time. These are the pictures of the yurt I was thinking of. So it's basically a 30-foot round structure, provides a central heated space, basically the village living room where we have our meetings. There's a lot more stuff in there now. This is a picture after it first opened, but basically serves as the central living room where they have computer and Wi-Fi access and things like that. We have a support committee that meets once a week to help residents resolve issues and provide support networks. We offer various classes and workshops through our yurt by connecting. This is a professor at the University of Oregon that taught a series of classes at the yurt, and just by providing, I think, a safe and legal place for people to exist, it then allows other resources to then provide those resources to the people rather than people being scattered all over the place. It provides a centralized place for things like this to happen. Community events, so we've actually had several residents that have gotten married since living in the village. And I think that's kind of a unique aspect of the project, is that traditional shelter models tend to make females and males live in separate quarters. And so oftentimes people that are married stay outside of the shelter system. We have several examples of people that were basically living out in the woods because they didn't want to be broken up, and then this offers a place where people can have their own private space. And then we also allow residents to have pets, which I think is another unique aspect. We don't have on-site services as part of the project, but we do have several partnerships, as I was saying. By providing that central space, it then provides possibilities for all these other organizations in town to reach out and offer their services. So a lot of times, the first 15 minutes of our village meeting is a different organization that tells a little bit about services that they have to offer. And then afterwards, residents can meet with those folks. And then since opening, we've added a quarter-time staff position called a village coordinator that kind of helps hold things together on a day-to-day basis. And then we also have a Portland State Masters of Social Work intern that's there 15 hours a week. Meets with residents on a regular basis to help them set goals and transition plans. This is just a quick overview of what you get versus what you give versus what you get. So residents pay a $30 a month utility fee to help offset operating costs. The front desk is staffed 24/7 by our residents. So each resident does 8 hours of front desk duty, and then 2 hours a week towards general community improvement or maintenance. It's a small bathroom, but we have about 30 residents, and so part of living there is cleaning the bathroom once a month, so it gets cleaned once a day. And then attendance at the weekly village meeting. And then in exchange, you get a small, safe, and private space to call your own, access to the common facilities I was talking about, computer and Wi-Fi access, quarterly bus pass, which I think is a pretty big one. so that people can get around to where they need to be. Look at the numbers. So we've been open for just over 4 years now. We have about 35 residents at a time. We've served about 132 people since opening, so over 4 years. That shows, that's about that doesn't mean that all 30 people move out in that year, but you have almost a full turnover per year. And then 56 people moving on to more permanent housing. And this was all built on a very shoestring budget with small donations from community members and churches and small local grants. We built the whole thing for just under $100,000. And then we estimate $114,000 in in-kind donations. So people coming out to swing hammers to build the houses and people donating materials to help those houses get built was a huge aspect of how this project happened. And I just think, obviously all of what I'm talking about, this isn't the ideal long-term solution, but it's an example of every city in America is facing an affordable housing crunch. There's not enough federal or state resources to go around to adequately address the issues. This provides an example of how we can provide drastic improvements in the quality of life to people that are otherwise sleeping on the streets with very little resources by utilizing the resources that already exist in our community. So if you amortize those capital costs over 5 years, it comes out to about $5 per person per night. Residents pay $30 a month, so that takes away $1. So we basically operate this facility on a budget of $4 per person per night, which we just do through ongoing fundraising and community events throughout the year. The University of Oregon did a survey in 2015 of the residents living there, found that 92% of residents reported that living at OVE gave them a sense of community, and 80% reported that living at OVE made them feel more independent. Safety is always a common concern and fear that comes up when when a project like this gets proposed. And it was, a very similar case here in Eugene. The police department also had that concern. But we have a nice quote here from the police department that it has not been a burden to the neighborhood in terms of a crime impact. And I'd actually argue that it's become a safer environment. I mentioned that we have a front desk that is staffed by residents 24/7, which provides more eyes on the street, creating more of a safer environment. We have a house across the street that actually caught fire in the middle of the night. There was a woman in a wheelchair on the second floor. The woman that was on front desk duty called 911 and was able to save that woman's life. So it's just an example of how by creating more active environments with more eyes on the street, you can create safer environments. Political support. So as I mentioned, this was a very new concept for our city. It took years of, going to city council meetings to let them let us do this. Finally, they said, okay, you can do it for a year, but with all the contracts in place to be able to pull the plug if it didn't work. It was approved by a 7-2 vote, which shows it was a little bit controversial. But after that first year, it got revisited. It was unanimously approved. And then more recently, it was on the consent calendar because it's such a non-controversial topic that the city council didn't even need to talk about it. So we've basically been operating on short-term leases that continue to get extended. So that was political support, but we also, I think the reason that it's so non-controversial is because we have a lot of public support. So in that same University of Oregon survey of surrounding neighbors, they found that 90% of neighboring residents and businesses were supportive of OVE, and most people reported that they noticed no change since the project had opened. So I think those sort of statistics outline the success of the project. Basically put us in a position as a newer nonprofit to do a second project, and rather than replicate the same project, we saw a need. The idea of Opportunity Village is to help folks transition to more permanent housing, and that has worked for some folks, but the truth of the matter is that there's just not that many resources out there. Section 8 vouchers, which is our primary way of getting people into affordable housing. We only fund for every 4 people that qualify for Section 8 housing, we only fund 1 voucher. So systematically, we basically build homelessness into the system. Looking at the wait times for affordable housing in our city, you see it gets longer as you go down in terms of bedrooms. So a lot of the affordable housing that does get built is the larger bedrooms for families, but there's not a lot of resources or housing getting built for singles and couples. And this is Bascom Village, the most recent affordable housing project to get built in Eugene. It comes at a cost of $169,000 per unit. So looking at the fact that our 5-year plan only anticipates about $15 million coming into the city to build more affordable housing, the issues clearly are not going to get addressed with the status quo, so we need to come up with more cost-effective permanent solutions. So that led us to propose Emerald Village, which is based on a similar village concept, but we wanted to develop something permanent, something that folks at Opportunity Village with some source of income could transition to. So with this project, we actually purchased our own land. We had a major donor that gave us a sizable donation that allowed us to do this. And we wanted to be able to develop something a little more substantial than Opportunity Village, but we weren't really able to do that there because of the short-term leases that I mentioned. So we worked with Opportunity Village residents to talk about what this place, should look like and how to develop a more permanent version of the model. And here's a rendering of the site. It's also an acre, has 22 units plus common buildings. And there's also a small parcel on here, which 2 other small houses are going to be built. And then we have a food cart area that we're hoping can provide some micro-business opportunities on the corner there. A few overview facts here. So the units are 160 to 300 square feet. Back at Opportunity Village, we're looking at around 80 square feet. So substantially larger, and they each have plumbing, sewer, and electricity going to each unit. So you'll have a kitchenette and a full bath built on a permanent slab foundation. Still supported by a community building that will have a larger kitchen, laundry facility, and a gathering space for the village meeting. Residents will be members of a housing cooperative, so it's sort of a hybrid between a rental and home ownership, where residents will pay $250 to $350 a month, that basically covers operating costs, utility costs, which are very low at the tiny house, and then $50 a month goes towards a share in the village, so that residents can accrue a share that they can then cash out and take with them when they move out. One of the things we learned with this project that we didn't really expect is that over half of the residents, so I guess I first should say that we already selected the residents for the project in advance, similar to the Opportunity Village project, so that they could be involved in kind of making some of the final decisions about how it would be operated. Over half of those folks are over the age of 60, so what we found is that there's lots of people out there with SSI, supplemental security income, where they have, around $700, $800 a month, but they're basically homeless because they can't afford, the first, last, and deposit to get a studio apartment, and then the severe shortage of Section 8 vouchers that I mentioned before. So $250 to $350 a month, that's, to be considered affordable, it should take up no more than 30% of your income, so this is something that could be affordable to somebody on that fixed income. Comes out to about $60,000 per unit to develop, so that includes the cost of the house, all the infrastructure, the site development, the landscaping, the common buildings. So substantially more expensive than Opportunity Village, but these houses meet the definition of a permanent dwelling, so we're basically going through these houses will be permitted similar to any other home in the city. And then the coolest part about the project that we really never expected, we started proposing this, and then we had 2 or 3 local architects that signed on saying they wanted to design one of the buildings. Then we gave a presentation at the local American Institute of Architect chapter meeting, and after that meeting, it seemed like every architect in the town wanted to do one of these tiny houses. So of the 22 homes, 14 are being donated 100% by these architects that then they either have a design build capacity or they partnered with local builders. And so they're basically pro bono designing, sourcing the materials, and leading the construction of the houses, which makes our job a lot easier because each house sort of has its own volunteer crew. These are all on our website, but I thought I would just show a few of these floor plans. So you see, oh no. Porch here, you come in, entry, a small kitchenette here with a fridge, sink and hot plate, bed nook here, loft above, bathroom with a sink, toilet, and shower. So this one's 236 square feet. Another example, this one was designed by a professor at the University of Oregon. Another one. This is a cool one. One thing that was neat is that in pre-selecting the residents, we allowed them to pick their top 3 houses that they were interested in living in. And of all the residents, each person got one of their top 2 picks. So I think that shows how different people have different needs. In this one, you have an older woman in her 60s who's living with her adult son who has some challenges, and basically they liked this unit because it's designed to be a living space here with bathroom, kitchen, and bedroom in the back, but they liked it because it has 2 separate entrances and they can basically have 2 living spaces separated by a bathroom and a kitchen, so that met their needs. This one, we're building 2 of these. They're designed to be to meet ADA accessibility requirements, all within 160 square feet. So that was a cool one. This is the largest one, the cube. It's actually where we got our name, Square One Villages, from. They named it Square One. Thought it was a good idea, and it actually has a full staircase in here. So here are some of the initial residents meeting, groundbreaking. Broke ground in the end of May of this year and have been busy building ever since. So these are some pictures of the progress. Some of the houses coming together there on the bottom. And here's that first floor plan I walked you through. It's kind of one of the ones that's furthest along, where you have the kitchen starting to come together, some cabinetry, and some of the bathroom there on the bottom right. And then more recently, we just received a grant to replicate the Emerald Village model in a rural community with fewer resources. So there was already a citizen coalition in Cottage Grove, Oregon, which is about 30 minutes down I-5, called the Cottage Village Coalition. They called us, asked if we could help, and we got this grant. So basically we're working with that group to help them implement a similar project in their neck of the woods. It's a cool project in that the property that we were able to purchase has an existing single-family house on it and a 1,400 square foot shop building. And the zoning density requirements in a rural community only allows 14 units per acre. So in addition to the single-family house, we'll be building 13 tiny houses. We'll use the shop building to build the tiny houses in the shop and then move them out to the site. And then we plan to retrofit the shop building into the common building. Then as part of that grant, we're also packaging the lessons that we learned from both of our first 2 projects and the process of working with another community into a village toolbox so that we can work with other communities with starting a similar project. And so we basically outlined these 10 major steps, sort of the 10 critical steps to starting a village, from concept to implementation to management. more information, a lot more information on our website, Square One Villages. Then I'll also have copies of my book available for sale after the presentation. You want me to?
So if we could turn the lights up so we can do the Q&A. Thank you. So can Commissioner Debbie O'Malley and Councilor Diane Gibson please come down? I thought that would be good to have a little bit of a panel and back and forth for the question and answer section. So Kathy should be here, and with the microphone to be able to go up there and to get some questions. So first of all, let's go ahead and have Commissioner and Councilor make some statements, and then we'll open up for Q&A, and we'll get some microphones out to the crowd so you can ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Bernadette, and I want to also add my thanks to Andrew for taking time to come and do this presentation. Just a little background. Prior to being on the City Council, which was many years ago, and now the County Commission, my background is in building affordable housing, and I was reminded of the project, Sawmill Community Land Trust project that was done in Sawmill is now it's going to be very, very successful, and it's built on land that is commonly owned. Just some of the same kinds of values that we looked at back then, and that was the biggest being this sense of community, and that's why this appealed to me, just personally appealed to me as someone in this community, that people really need to have that feeling that they belong in a community, which is why we live in neighborhoods, which is why we live in communities. But I think there's a heightened need for that for people, especially who have been traumatized and who feel very isolated. So this appealed to me. And one other thing I think that's important too is, actually Councilor Gibson invited me some time ago, it's been over a year now, to go see the Hope Village in Las Cruces. Hope Village is a tent city. Actually, it's a tent camp. It's not really a city. It's a tent camp. I don't want to call them cities. It's a tent camp, and I didn't really know what to expect when we went there. So we went to visit it, and they had this little house in the front, and there's all the rules listed on there about behavior and what you can and cannot do. And people were very proud of it. It was very, very simple, but they had these areas that were marked off for tents, and they had all this ownership. It was also self-governing. As I was leaving the village, and as you know, being a woman, I'm 60 years old. I'm fortunate to have a house. But as I was leaving, this car pulls up, and very nice car. And I noticed two ladies get out with very fancy purses. Women think about, they notice things like that. They start to unload their truck and they went to Costco, right? And so they start to bring in food to the main community. And what that said to me is, these women feel safe enough to pull up in their car and to contribute, That really stuck in my mind, because what happens is when people, and all of us in the community